Good afternoon, and welcome to everybody. What promises to be an interesting way to kick off this 20th anniversary of Proposition 13 and what I call Proposition 13 and its progeny. All the children, grandchildren, and the like that have cropped up in the form of initiatives in state legislation in the last 20 years. I thought it was a stroke of brilliance on Tim's part that he saw that it would be a good way to start this conference off would be to start with two clear voices, two penetrating voices, both of whom in some ways were present at the creation. It does not necessarily mean that they will assume full responsibility for parentage, but they were certainly around and were involved in watching it unfold on a front line and a personal basis. I have some guidelines on the debate format here, and I'll turn to those in a minute. But what I want to do, first of all, is introduce both speakers, and then I will say a little something about the guidelines, and then I will let them go at it, and my only job will be to keep out of the way and set a time clock on them. Let me start out, first of all, by welcoming and introducing Schrag Stubblebine, a professor of political economy at the Claremont McKenna College. He's a member of the graduate faculty, also at the graduate faculty at the Claremont Graduate School, and it says here, a native of Texas. We've got two folks here who are actually, three folks at this table who are not native Californians, which is pretty much the way the state is. He has his PhD in economics from the University of Virginia, and aside from a number of distinguished activities that he's engaged in over the course of his academic career in Southern California, I want to bring to your attention a publication he wrote in 1991, which kind of signals his interest and thoughts about this topic. He co-wrote a piece with a gentleman by the name of Rodney Smith called Maintaining the Legacy of Proposition 13, because that kind of puts it on the line. He wrote that in 1991, and he's an editor and a contributor to a book called Reaganomics, a Midterm Report, that was published in 1983. I asked Schrag to provide me with a quote that would sort of capture his views about this subject, to kind of get him characterized or placed in a box or whatever. And he stereotype. And he didn't let me down. He gave me a one-sentence quote, which I will read to you. Let me preface it by saying that this quote is quoting from a statement he made right after the passage of Prop 13, and he was actually presenting a paper at the Western Tax Association meetings, where he said, in the end, one suspects that politics and statesmanship will join to ensure that life in California will continue more or less tolerably. Now that's a hell of an endorsement for Prop 13 right there. We'll get it. Well, tolerably is so. On that introduction, let me then turn to Peter Schrag's introduction and say that he hardly needs any introduction to this group, but there's a couple of things I do want to bring to your attention. First of all, as you all know, for many years he was the editorial page editor of the Sacramento Bee, and it says here that he recently retired from that position, though I have seen no indication of him retiring from anything. He's probably more active as a writer today than he was as he was editing the editorial page. He's certainly a well-known observer of the political scene in California, and like on your right, an immigrant from Texas, Peter is an immigrant from the East Coast, or I should say a migrant, to get precise about it. And he saw California as the golden dream, like the rest of us, some 28 years ago, or El Dorado, or whatever you happen to have seen it as. And on top of all that, of course, in the last year, he has written and published through a major publisher, a book that has been hugely successful, widely read, and what we know is widely reviewed, which we all know what that means. That means it was reviewed in the New York Times. And it's been hugely successful for Peter and for, in a sense, advertising the issue about Prop 13 and is it good for us or bad for us. I want a couple of things I want to bring to your attention about this book. This is sort of a sales pitch, but you're probably not going to, right? I just want to say the one sentence quote that kind of sums up Peter's view of Prop 13 is, beginning with the passage of the tax cutting Proposition 13 in 1978 and continuing through a barrage of voter initiatives, the state has pursued a determined course of retrenchment and reaction, sending it tumbling to the bottom of the nation's quality of life rankings. Press on, Peter, the East Coast awaits you. I can also bring to your attention in this book chapter, actually it doesn't have a chapter a number, but a chapter called The Spirit of 13, which is the summary story of how this initiative was passed and the fascinating politics involved in that. He wraps up that chapter by saying, it has both narrowed the sense of place and curtailed the sense of time in which public choices are made, reducing them to a set of ad hoc, single-purpose decisions laid end to end. And I think that pretty much summarizes Peter's view of Prop 13. So with that, as by way of introduction, what I'm going to do is, I've had a discussion with both of these gentlemen prior to this. We are going to start off with Peter first, on the grounds that he is the person who is the most focused critiquer and certainly the most popular and widely read critiquer of Prop 13 and its consequences. He will have 15 minutes to make his statement, so to speak. I will then turn to Professor Stubblebine to, in effect, give a rebuttal. He'll have 15 minutes. They will then have, each of them, a 5-minute period of time to say almost anything they want to. And then we will open it up to Q&A at that point, because I really want to get audience participation. I have a suspicion you're all going to have many penetrating questions yourself. So with that, Peter, we will start it off with you.
Thanks, David. I should start right off with a disclaimer that that first quote that David read is from the jacket blurb, and as you probably know, authors don't write jacket blurbs, publicists do. And so while I won't necessarily deny it, I wouldn't put it quite that boldly. Anyway, it's terrific to be here, and let me say something right off the bat that sort of I think summarizes my position about 13, which is a kind of, I suppose, a sort of a paraphrase of Woody Hayes, who, as you probably know, often said that when you throw a forward pass, 3 things can happen. 2 of them are bad. I think that's kind of my summary of Prop 13. When it passed, 3 things happened, one of which was good, which is that the the taxpayers got reliability in their property taxes, all taxpayers. As my good friend Joel Fox, who is the head of the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, and I say that quite not ironically, says for the first time it was the taxpayer who had reliability rather than the tax collector. And I think that's absolutely true. And then there were 2 bad things. The first of the 2 bad things had to do with the substance of policy, and the second had to do with the policy process, and I'll talk about each of them in turn. And I should also say that I'm, as David does, I'm using the notion of Proposition 13 generically, Proposition 13 and its progeny, because as you know, after Proposition 13 passed in June of 1978, the voters of California passed a whole series of other tax reduction and spending limitation measures, beginning with Proposition 4, the so-called GAN spending limit, in '79. We indexed the income tax. We virtually eliminated the inheritance tax, and so on and so on. We tinkered, I think, 18 or 20 times at the margins with Prop 13 to make it tighter, or to at least extend its protections. You can now leave your home to your children and even your grandchildren, and it will not be reassessed. You can add various improvements, and it will not be reassessed, on down to Prop 218 in 1996, which is probably screwing the tax limitations down even tighter. The consequences, as I say, in terms of substance, I think were many. Whenever and they were primarily felt in what was, I think, an exacerbation of the decline, the relative decline in California public services. When I say relative decline, I mean relative to the other states in the Union. As other states were increasing theirs, and that's particularly true, of course, in public education. California in the 60s and even in the mid-70s was somewhere in the top third in its per pupil spending in the nation. By the late 80s, we were approaching the bottom third. This was before the recession. By the time the recession got into full swing in the early 90s, we were, I think, 41st. With substantial new spending now, with the windfalls of the so-called of the last few years, and new investment in schools, we're back up to, the estimate is somewhere between 35th and 38th in the country in what we spend per pupil, still well below what the other major industrial states spend. I think we spend roughly half, maybe a little over half per pupil of what New York and New Jersey spend. Now you can argue that spending on schools does not equal quality. If you're a good conservative economist, you would certainly say that. I don't want to anticipate what's going to be said later, but certainly in a state like this, which at the same time over the same period faced increasingly heavy burdens in the population that it was educating or trying to educate, in the number of limited English-speaking students, in the increase, the higher growing rate of in other ways affected students, number of kids from welfare homes, single-parent homes, all the rest. The task in California, both at the front end, at the back end, which would be the end of the needs for higher levels of education, increased even as our spending relative to the rest of the country declined. The same thing, of course, occurred in a number of other areas. You just have to look at our what's happened in our public libraries. A few blocks from here, we have a wonderful new public library that the city built back in the 80s, partly by putting a little lever to some developers who helped build the library. It's a lovely building. When it opened, and I think to this day, the city couldn't afford to keep it open more than 35 hours a week, and never in the evenings. That, it seems to me, is one of those interesting indications of what happened in the Prop 13 era. We can look at a whole series of other things, the plight of the counties in providing a whole set of social services, whether you talk about numbers, caseloads, it all went down, not to perdition, but from a level where California, certainly in the 60s, was regarded nationwide as being a model for the nation and a magnet in its social optimism, in its public services, in the quality of its governmental systems. It became, I think, increasingly an embarrassment in the late 80s and early 90s. Let me talk now for a minute about the policy process, and this has to do with what people generally call the unintended consequences of Proposition 13. Surely the voters who voted for Prop 13, and they did it, I think, for good reasons in many cases, did not intend to move fiscal control from their local school board, their local city council, their local board of supervisors to the California legislature. They certainly did not intend to confound accountability as between Sacramento and the local authorities. We have in California, and there are people in this room, one of the things that's sort of awkward for me is that I'm talking to many of my sources here who know a lot more about some of this stuff than I do. One of the things that clearly has occurred is that the property tax ceased to be a local tax, became a state tax eventually, and we can talk about the fiscal history of that if you'd like to later on, controlled by the legislature essentially, which has moved it back and forth at will depending on circumstances. The result has been that in many areas, increasingly it becomes harder and harder for the citizen, and even the very diligent citizen, to understand how the state works, to understand where fiscal accountability lies. Does it lie between the local school board, which overspends its budget, or does it lie in Sacramento with the governor and legislature, which have not appropriated enough money to do the job? I'm being perhaps overly simplistic at this point, and I'm sure we can refine it as we go along. It's further confounded, of course, the local planning process. I don't want to talk too much about fiscalization, so-called, of land use, which is basically an exacerbated, there's always been, of course, competition between local governments for new taxpayers, meaning businesses and industry and so on. But in California, it's been intensified and sharpened, particularly in the competition because the property tax is now such a marginal thing in supporting local government in the search for sales taxpayers. So we have everybody going out trying to get, rather than trying to do organized planning and sort of balanced development, we go after the shopping mall, the auto mall, and all the rest, because it's the sales tax that will keep the city budget healthy. In addition to that, of course, we have this rather intense now what is called welcome stranger kind of ethos in California, which puts the burden. How are we doing on time, David? I haven't been keeping time.
You're doing 5 minutes.
Okay. Which puts an increasing share of the burden of the cost of infrastructure development on new infrastructure improvements on new development, both residential development and business development, through developer fees, through obviously the double the way that our taxes work, since you can't reassess. It means that new homes and new business is assessed at cost, whereas everything else is, of course, assessed at the time of the last transfer. So, as you all know, you can have adjacent homes or adjacent businesses of equal value paying very different levels of property tax. So more and more of the burden, both through the fee process and through this inequitable tax system, goes to the new kid on the block, whether it's a homeowner or a business. You may know that some years ago, Macy's filed suit in California because it felt it was being overtaxed relative to its competitors across the street. I can't remember what the competing shopping center was, but it was somewhere in the East Bay, in Contra Costa County. The case moved up, was about to go to the Supreme Court, and then an organized campaign began in California, exacerbated in part by the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, and all of a sudden Macy's began to receive hundreds and hundreds of shredded credit cards from the fans of Prop 13, and Macy's dropped the case. Anyway, the contortion of local planning, where basically local governments would much prefer to go after the sales taxpayers than the light industry, the job creator. A plan for infill to do balanced development has become a matter of extensive discussion and debate around California and continues to this day. But I think that probably the more serious effect in terms of process is simply that it does confound accountability. It further alienates the citizen because he or she really can't understand how the system works. Finally, let me say that this has become a self kind of reinforcing vicious cycle. We go from proposition to proposition. Each measure, of course, further circumscribes the authority of government to function, to make decisions, to set priorities, which of course then increases the chances and the propensity of government to make those decisions because they're always looking over their shoulders at the taxpayers or at the voters. And the result is that you go from proposition to proposition. The most interesting, I think, illustration, the most obvious, is how we went. We went, of course, from Prop 13 to the GAN spending limit. The GAN spending limit was passed at a time of increasing inflation. Nobody expected that there would ever come a time when it would really begin to bite, but by 1986 or 1987, it did bite, and it came to the point, some dispute about how the political decision was made, where Governor Deukmejian refunded to the taxpayers $1 billion+ as being over the GAN spending limit. Of course, much of that money came out of the schools, which always got a large share of the general fund. The school lobby, led by the then Superintendent of Public Instruction, Bill Honig, and the California Teachers Association, and qualified a measure to make sure that at least their slice of that pie would always be protected. That became Proposition 98, which now, of course, is a further constraint on our fiscal flexibility, and off we go. So you have one measure leading to another, leading to another. There are other illustrations, but I think this is the best. Let me finally say that sometimes I've been accused of being or that the people who are the critics of Prop 13 are all accused of being hopeless liberals who don't trust the public, don't trust the people. And on this one, all I can say is that and those of us who I think hold that position stand fairly firmly with such other hopeless liberals like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, who also had great suspicion of great democracy, or direct democracy, felt that it could lead to a tyranny of majorities, which I think is not exactly what's happened, though I do think that the initiative process by its nature is a majoritarian process that is never by its nature respectful of minorities. I don't mean just ethnic minorities, I mean all kinds of political minorities. Interestingly enough, at the turn of the century, in the second decade of the century, there were challenges that came mostly from Oregon, challenging the initiative process itself as being a violation of the Constitution's guarantee of Republican government in the United States. The Supreme Court ducked it. It said it's not a judicial issue, it's a political issue, and it has to be for Congress and the legislatures to resolve it. But there are still people who are looking at that, and it's still an interesting, vexing kind of issue, not as something that is going to provide a remedy tomorrow morning, but as a sort of an interesting indication of where our history, where the initiative process and the way we use it sets up next to our constitutional history. And as I say, I think that puts me with Hamilton and Madison, and maybe with Edmund Burke, and not with the people who nowadays call themselves conservative. I think this is a very conservative position, and I will leave it at that for Professor Stubblebine.
Right on, 15 minutes.
So you're going to tell me in 5 minutes?
I'm going to give you 15 minutes now, and then yes, I'll let you know.
Okay. I want to thank you, Mr. Lyon and Mr. Schrag. and all of those of you who are willing to come today and revisit Prop 13 20 years ago. Peter Schrag makes clear that Prop 13 is not the only thing that happened before and after Prop 13, which made me a little bit uncomfortable in terms of focusing on Prop 13. And I'm not necessarily persuaded that in some sense Prop 13 is the watershed act in California. Nevertheless, on the 20th anniversary of Prop 13, perhaps there is some value to all of us in going back and kind of rethinking this a little bit. I'd like to touch on 4 points in my remarks. The first has to do with the 1% limit. It seems to me Prop 13 clearly set out to do 4 things. First, to impose a 1% limit on local property tax rates and a 2% limit on the annual growth of property tax assessments, the growth of property tax assessments. Second, a reduction of property taxes from on average, say, 2% of state personal income to about 1%, or about a 2% property tax rate to about a 1% property tax rate. Third, to attempt to protect property tax reductions from being offset by increases in other taxes, the supermajority rules at the local level, for example, some rules at the state level. And fourth, a general shift in fiscal power from local governments to state government. For many here, perhaps most, perhaps all, these aspects of Prop 13 are known, and my remarks then would serve merely to reorient our collective memories about this period. Turning to the first one, I'm reminded of this aspect of Prop 13 every year when we receive our property tax bill from the County of Los Angeles. Not only am I reminded about the 1% limit and the 2% reassessment rate, but I'm very grateful at that point. While both impart to my property taxes an enormous predictability and stability, the 2% reassessment provision was, in my judgment, sheer genius. Though some, though none here, of course, have taken umbrage at this provision, Peter actually would support it, it can and should serve as a model for property tax assessment nationwide. On the day I buy my house, my property tax commitment is predictable for the balance of my tenure in that house. To be sure, if you come along, say 10 years later, and buy a comparable abode next door, your property tax may be significantly higher than mine in each year thereafter. Is that unfair? How so? Consider that each of us remains in our respective properties for, say, 30 years. Total up my property tax payments from the first year to the 30th year and divide by my base property tax valuation. Do the same for your payments from year 11 to year 40. Lo, each of us will have paid exactly the same percentage, exactly the same 30-year rate on our properties. Okay? I see nothing unfair in that, and the Macy's case notwithstanding, the U.S. Supreme Court, in another case, did not find this provision to be unconstitutional. So while the Macy's case was withdrawn for whatever reasons, another case did test this provision, and the U.S. Supreme Court did not find it unconstitutional. But I see nothing unfair in it, nor did the Supreme Court. Moreover, by reassessing sold property to current market value, the genius accomplished 2 things. First, I and you can enjoy our respective protections only by remaining in our respective properties. I, a 1974 owner, cannot keep you from the full fruits of your protection since no owner can capitalize the 1974 property tax base savings into some future selling price. Only the value of the 1%, 2% protection can be capitalized, and one would anticipate that property tax values would rise after the adoption of Prop 13, and they did. Second, with reassessment upon sale comes an increase in property tax revenues. However, once in equilibrium, this provision generates a relatively constant share of state personal income. Until equilibrium, the provision actually generates a rising share of state personal income, a factoid consistent with property taxes as a percentage of state personal income, rising from 2.64% in 78-79 to 3.21% in 1994-95. Now, it's also true that in a period of low inflation, the 2% maximum reassessment has much less power, but the power of that is to protect people during periods of rapid inflation, rapid growth in market values of property. Second, property taxes were reduced, everybody knows that. Between 1975-76 and 78-79, property tax revenues fell from almost $9 billion to $6 billion. As a share of state personal income, property tax revenues fell from just under 6% to 2.6%. Now, I've used state personal income, and lots of other people do, and the reason for that perhaps should be revisited just briefly. If the population doubles, you expect your government to spend more. You got to have twice as many people. You need more police, more fire, more schools, more roads. If prices go up, if you have inflation, if you double the prices, then you have to double the dollars spent to keep things as they were. After all, the police and fire and teachers need to have more salaries so they can keep food on their table and roofs over their heads. Third, productivity. A rising private standard of living may call forth in us a desire for a rising public standard of living. Better roads and parks are complements to better automobiles and shorter work weeks. Better schools may be also something we would like to see out of our increased income. Now, even as many are in despair over the state of California government, the fact is that fires still are extinguished, bad guys are still arrested, kids go to school, the sun still rises in the east and sets in the west. Indeed, life continues tolerably well here. Third, attempting to avoid an offsetting tax increases. To some extent, beauty here may be in the eye of the beholder. If you want an education in what counts, Mr. Lyon, I'm sure, be happy to lead you through his Institute's report, has Proposition 13 delivered. However, I would draw your attention to different aspects. First, pre-Prop 13, income and general sales taxes generated about the same in revenues, about $4 billion, while the property tax generated about $9 billion. By 94-95, each of these, property tax, income taxes, and general sales taxes, were generating roughly equal amounts in the 20 to $24 billion range, and roughly equal amounts of share of personal income, 3.1 to 3.4%. While the growth in the share of state personal income is not dramatic, income taxes increased from 2.7% to 3.4%. General sales tax went from 2.9 to 3.1%. They're also not insignificant increases because they towed up to about 1% of state personal income. And in 1994-95, 1% of state personal income is worth about $7 billion of additional revenues to the state. At the same time, there was indeed a dramatic increase in current charges, mostly in miscellaneous general government revenues, up from 3% of state personal income in 75-76 to 5.2% in 94-95, so up a little over 2%, or up about $14 billion in 94-95. Turning to spending, the story is much the same overall. In 75-76, general expenditures represented 20% of state personal income. They fell to 17% in 78-79, the first year after Prop 13, and recovered to 21% by 94-95. In fact, by 94-95, California governments are spending a larger share of state personal income than they were prior, in the heyday prior to Prop 13. And if you accept Peter Schrag, they're enjoying it a whole lot less. Finally, there was the shift in fiscal power, and I think that's well documented. And indeed, it was this aspect of Prop 13 that kept me personally from supporting Prop 13. The question really is, what do we do now? Where do we go from here on this front? Now, Schrag suggests that the voters did not intend to move fiscal control from local governments to the state, but it's my understanding that Howard Jarvis indeed intended that to happen, apparently because he was discouraged by his dealings with local government officials, and he was more than happy to see power move to the state. I understand you have a poll that suggests the citizens of the great state of California turn out to be quite comfortable with the current distribution of fiscal powers. So the real question is, okay, given that background, where do we go from here? And in what happens after this, maybe that's where we can spend some time. I certainly have some ideas about it. The issue about distortion of incentives, because it's tied in with this fiscal power issue, Peter Schrag gave several kinds of examples, including the issues with respect to development. I quite agree. Local governments in general are driven to find more revenues. Pre-Prop 13, it was relatively easy. You just raised the property tax rate. Post-Prop 13, that door was closed, and local governments started going in other directions. I live in the city of Claremont, and certainly the city parents there seem to be hell-bent for election to find money anywhere they can. But in terms of this incentives, you know, it's causing local governments to do insane things. The flip side of that is maybe it just reflects an unwillingness of local government officials, elected officials, to live within their revenues.
On that note, that's a good point at which to local government officials are unwilling to live within their constraints. Peter, you have 5 minutes of either embellishment, rebuttal, or you can turn your time over to your opposition.
Well,
if you think he needs more help, you could give him more time.
Well, if I were trying to do, you know, it's sort of a grand geste, I suppose that would be the thing to do. Let me just say two things, a couple of things. One is I don't feel any better having heard Professor Stubblebine. I do know that the sun still comes up in the east, it sets in the west, and that life continues tolerably well for those of us who are not dependent very heavily on public services, though as I drive around the roads in California, my shock absorbers tell me that it doesn't continue as well as I'd like it to. That's certainly true if you're dependent on the schools. It's certainly true in the increasing charges that perhaps appropriately we impose on our public university students, and I think that's those are all things. It's certainly not true with respect to a lot of people who are desperately dependent on public services. Secondly, I strongly disagree with Professor Stubblebine's assertion that we are not spending a higher that we are spending a higher percentage of personal income on public services, on public purposes now than we did before Prop 13. Every study, including the most recent one that's just come from David Lyon's shop, says we're, in fact, the burden of taxation and I think fees, and I can't remember what fees you included, is in fact went down considerably after 13, then climbed up again in the 80s, but is not back to where it was in 1978. Also, of course, again, in comparison to other states, we were a high tax state in the 60s and 70s. We are now an average tax state by most accountings. So we are, and I'm not complaining that we're an average tax state. I'm just saying that we're obviously not a place that's a high tax state. But I think that I rest with my major points, which are that I think the level of our public services and the comprehensibility of our public process has declined considerably. And I think we've become a place where the center of gravity has gone now to the initiative process. I think the initiative process by its nature is not something that you can use very efficiently or very effectively, particularly in the way it's set up in California. We're one of the few states in the country where the legislature is basically prevented from doing any kind of amendment or fixes of an initiative once it's passed, unless, of course, the initiative itself provides for it. And therefore, the flexibility and the kind of accountability that you would have in a normal system is simply beginning to evaporate in California. And I think that worries me more than the substantive stuff. I think the process stuff, I think in the long run, is of more concern, and the kind of public alienation that comes with it, I think is significant. And I would worry more about that than about spending limits. I think I don't think we've seen the end of it. If you look at your next ballot, you will see all kinds of wonderful things. Again, an attempt to lock certain public policy decisions away into the Constitution, even though they're already public policy, like class size reduction in California, which the legislature approved, the governor approved, even before there were any substantive evidence that it was really paying off. Governor now wants to lock that into so that the legislature can't touch it. As you know, we have a whole range of other things that are, I think, you know, from the sale of horse meat to Indian gaming, and I don't think that's where our decisions ought to be made in the long run.
Thank you, Peter. Greg?
Since I do want to talk about the data a little bit, I guess I need to face up to this Lyon report.
Well, actually, it's not mine. I have my data. You can.
If you listen to Peter Schrag very carefully, he talked, and the Lyon report talks about the burden of taxation. My references were to spending, not to the revenue side, but to the spending side. And to the best of my knowledge, that report does not address the spending side. So citing that as evidence that spending can't be there doesn't work. The evidence is that spending is in fact up, is in fact up. Now that doesn't gainsay that people might feel very uncomfortable with what's happening. If you look at the data sort of pre-Prop 13 and today, or 94, 95, certain categories of spending are in fact taking a larger share of state personal income than they did prior to Prop 13. Among those, social services and income maintenance, transportation, public safety, environment and housing, government administration, and interest on the general debt. Taking a smaller share, education is the primary one that's taking a smaller share. right? So you can look at all the education thing and say, look, Prop 13 has caused this terrible thing, but then you ignore the fact that at the same time you have Prop 13, all these other categories of government spending are taking larger shares. The problem apparently is not in the totals, but in how the legislative process has divvied up the pot among various kinds of government services. That's a whole different issue than somehow Prop 13 has totally constrained government to second citizenship. Now, it is true that California, relative to the rest of the United States, did drop marginally between pre-Prop 13 and 94, 95. Those ratios are down in some areas, but again, California actually gained in, for example, public safety. California's actually, relative to other states, is actually spending more now than it did prior to Prop 13. So that really requires a much more complicated kind of discussion than has come across to this point. Okay?
Thank you, Greg. I almost feel like I have to do a bit of the clarification on the so-called Lyon report. First of all, it's not a Lyon report, but I do want to bring to everybody's attention that in your packets there is a research brief, and you don't have to go into it now, but it's number 12, and it's called "Has Proposition 13 Reduced the California Tax Burden?" And just as a point of clarification, this report, by the way, is prepared by a gentleman on our staff by the name of Michael Shires, and John Elwood and Mary Sprague, who's no longer with us, but is a graduate student, I think, at one of our local universities. I do want to clarify that indeed this study does focus only on revenues and not on total spending for two reasons. One is that the substantial share of spending that is tied up with intergovernmental transfers, largely from the federal level, that has affected the total outlay. And so we were trying to sort of hold that constant, so to speak, to see how Prop 13 affected local collections, state and local, in that definition of local. The second reason we left out spending, Craig, is that it gets really complicated to sort out double counting problems when you're looking at intergovernmental transfers. The counties are using monies collected by the states. You've got to crosswalk every single one of those different sources. And so we stuck for elegance purposes and purity of measure purposes to revenues that we could look at that were definitely local in nature, and it also eliminated the prospect of double counting. So that's just a point of clarification.
And I wasn't criticizing the report because it focused on the tax burden. It didn't focus on spending, okay? But they're two different things.
And so I just did that to clarify that for you, because I didn't want you to all walk away thinking that you're hearing two different things between this study. I do want to turn this over to Q&A at this point. We have about 4 minutes before I'm going to do so. I have a question. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here, and I have distilled my reactions down to 2 questions, one for each of our speakers. And I'd like to start first with Peter, and perhaps this will anticipate some of the questions you might have in this area, and I'll read it in its long version. Why has this direct democracy resulted in such a critique by decision makers at the state level when in fact they're the very people, the very decision makers who could have avoided the passage of Prop 13 in 1978, but through gridlock seemed unable to come to grips with that subject? And it seems to me that the progeny have been generated in large part because that gridlock continues. And so, as a Hamilton, I'm asking you to answer that.
Are you asking me to defend Jerry Brown? Is that what you're trying, is that what you're doing?
You can defend anybody you would like to. I think there's more people than Jerry Brown involved.
Well, that's
in this
true.
gridlock.
No, absolutely. But I mean, there are obviously a whole lot of people involved. One of the things that I think is important to mention here, and that, obviously, there were enormous divisions at the time within the legislature, even though both houses at that time, I think, were controlled by Democrats, but they were not in the Senate. It was not a a two-thirds majority of Democrats, and even the Democrats who were there were, of course, different kinds of Democrats. There were rural Democrats and there were urban liberals, and they were all trying to fix it their own way, and they never did get together. And the history of that is long and interesting and complicated, and there are, again, people in the room who know a hell of a lot more about this than I do. But I will say that there is one element that I don't think has been discussed enough, two elements. One is, and I thought Professor Stubblebine would bring it up, was the shadow of the Serrano v. Priest decisions, which I think had some, and we can talk about that. The other is this unique thing that California has, which is the requirement of a two-thirds majority to pass any budget or any fiscal measure, and that, I think, is as close to what we might come to some version of sort of procedural original sin, because that really did make the thing much harder, it seemed to me, in 1978. I don't think it's been analyzed enough. I didn't do it, but I think it is an issue. I would like to say something else, David, about the change in the mix of how we spend, and that we spend a lot more on public safety and so on. One of the things that happened with, and I know I'm going to sound like Ray Davis filibustering something, but I don't mean to, but one of the things that happened, certainly, as a result of this shift in accountability and the fact that local governments could no longer essentially impose taxes, is that business groups and local conservative groups began to lose interest in the local political process. And so you had fewer business people and other conservatives running for and supporting and putting money into the run for office, which meant that the public sector unions, the firefighters, the cops, and the teachers unions particularly became the biggest players in local elections. They were always big players. They became bigger players. And if you look at the change in mix, often the change in mix will follow the power of those public sector unions. And one of the interesting things is that as we capped, as our ADA spending relative to the rest of the country went down for public schools, what we spent for teachers, and I'm not against paying money for teacher salaries, but what we spent for teachers did not go down relative to the rest of the country, basically. And so, of course, everything else got squeezed all the more. The same thing, of course, happened with firefighters and cops, who have been major players now in a lot of local government elections. And I think that's one of the reasons that this mix changed. I don't think it was, and of course also because they have clout in Sacramento. But I think it's just an interesting observation on the side.
Thank you, Peter. Craig, I'm now going to give you your first question, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. My question in this area, that you in effect are, even though it didn't sound that way as you were speaking, because you said in fact you didn't support Prop 13 as an individual when it passed, and so it's amazing the number of people I meet who didn't support Prop 13, yet somehow that damn thing passed by the largest share in the history of California or whatever. Can you address the issue of the whole initiative process, and with the 13 as an example, of what I would call the collateral damage that happens when you take a simple idea and you say, I just want to get some principles down here, simple principles, and all of a sudden those simple ideas and principles begin to ripple through the system and create the kinds of problems you've eloquently demonstrated, that in fact our spending may well be up for reasons having nothing to do with 13, or might be something related to 13, but that we don't always know what's going to happen from these initiatives. And given that they are frequently constitutional in nature, isn't this a pretty terrible way to go about making public policy?
Well, I guess let me respond to your last question first. Certainly, Mr. Schrag's remarks were anti-initiative. I have certainly been part of the initiative process over the years, intimate in two of them, Prop 1 under Reagan and Prop 4 with Gann, only to watch the initiative process, in fact, got Prop 4 in the end. So I'm not entirely sure that the initiative process, I'm not persuaded that the initiative process is necessarily the end all. Same time, I think Hiram Johnson had it right. By gosh, when the legislature won't do it and the people want something done, then that's the way to get it done. And the legislature does, in fact, have substantial role to play, and if they get their act together, can certainly influence the outcome in significant ways. One of the ways is to clean up, put on the ballots technical amendments to these things that can be passed 2 years later. Okay, so this is not an impossible process. I think, in many respects, I think what you're observing is a body politic that is fractured. Now, why is it fractured? I don't think Prop 13 is the reason the body politic is fractured. In fact, the evidence is that the body politic was becoming fractured long before 13 came along. In your book, in Schrag's book, he correctly notes that Watson ran 2 initiatives on the property tax back in the early 70s. Reagan's Prop 1 was certainly a clarion call that the voters of California were getting more and more uncomfortable with what was happening. Now, I have not read every word of Peter Schrag's book. I'm sorry, Peter, I haven't done that.
It's okay.
Right?
You're not the only one that has read every word.
But you did buy it.
Well, I did buy it, and I did peruse a significant chunk of it. And I came away with the following hypothesis: that the halcyon days of Pat Brown, I vaguely remember him, the halcyon days of Pat. Now, partly that's because I didn't arrive in the state, I think, until 1966, maybe. The halcyon days of Pat Brown in the early 60s. And this book just emotes with how wonderful life was in that period. It's less wonderful, apparently, under Reagan, though Pat Brown and Ronald Reagan share one characteristic, at least in common. They both presided over a rapidly engorging government, certainly as measured by a share of state personal income, and it's virtually unbroken. You could not tell when Reagan took office. That's true. Why are those the halcyon days? And I have a very simple hypothesis. It's a lot more fun when you're spending more next year than you spent last year. It's just more fun. You're out there building new buildings and making new programs, and you're taking a larger share, and life seems just much better. In terms of absolutes, Brown actually spent a significantly smaller share of state personal income than was characteristic in the first post-Prop 13 world. Brown's share of state personal income was lower than the post-Prop 13 environment. And yet everybody thinks that that was a wonderful period. And the only thing that I can think of is it's just much more fun to spend more. It's like a corporation. Life in a company is a lot more fun when sales and profits are getting larger than when sales are going down and profits are shrinking. Life is hell in those companies, and it's wonderful in the others. But that's not a basis on which to do public decisions, because you can't keep taking a larger share of the body politic's income. Because if you're taking a larger public share, necessarily you're leaving them with a smaller private share. And I guarantee you, ultimately, there's going to be a tax revolt. The good times are going to come to an end if the good times are measured by engorging government. The alternative is to say, hey, we got some things what need getting done, and yeah, the roads have got to be there, the police have got to be there, the schools have got to operate, but we don't necessarily need to have El Dorado.
going back to that word. Peter and Craig, thank you very much. I'd like to now open the debate to the floor, and I will call on the first hand that I see. Way in the back of the room, I see a hand from David Abel. You're going to have to shout, David.
I wonder if we could focus on some common ground. If I understood Professor Stubblebine, he said the fourth point on the objectives of the Jarvis Initiative were to transfer power to the state, and that was one of the reasons you opposed it. If I can look at the symmetry of what Peter Schrag has said, which is that he has found some great difficulties with what's happening with the process, do we have some common ground here between the two of you that we can work on? Does it have to be a debate? Howard Jarvis, current president, is Joel Fox, and he has the same problem of the transfer, what he calls the unintended consequence of the transfer of power, and would like to fix it as well. Is there common ground on this panel to work on that fourth issue and transfer back some sovereignty and power to the local level through the taxes?
I've been asked to summarize the question for the purposes of the taping. The question is there a common ground between the two speakers on the notion that the shifting of the taxation power to the state level was probably not a good consequence of 13. Perhaps it was an unintended consequence, although it was clearly written in the language of, it was written, if not necessarily clearly, but the consequences have been that the power has been shifted to the state. Is there a common ground between the two of you that this is a bad outcome of that proposition?
Well, I've said it, and yes, and I certainly agree. It is, and I think, in fact, it was written into Prop 13. Yes, it is clearly written into Prop 13. I think partly because I don't think that Howard Jarvis and Paul Gann could figure out an easy way to resolve the question of how you divvy up, and to do it simply, how you divvy up the property tax because of the overlapping local jurisdictions. So I think they just sort of said, let's let the legislature do it, and that was a simple way. It's a one-sentence statement in the initiative.
But I don't think I don't think it troubled. My impression from people I've talked to who said it didn't trouble Jarvis in the least to see all the power go up, in spite of the fact that he and Reagan seemed to be, in some sense, got along. Reagan was always trying to push things down to the smallest level of government. Jarvis apparently was prepared to see them go up. You didn't really respond to the question. Is there
well, I don't know. I agree with David Abel, as he knows. I absolutely think that it's a bad thing that all this that local government has been enervated of its authority and accountability and flexibility, and that all this authority has moved up. So, and I can't speak for you, but I certainly speak for me on that.
But do you have a solution?
Well, I don't think that was
that was not the question.
I'd like to go to the next question. There was another hand and over here.
In your presentation regarding the essential fairness of Prop 13 regarding homeowners, should you draw a meaningful distinction between homeowners and the owners of business property, or does the same glowing generalization apply there both for them and it doesn't matter what you policy?
Okay, I need to repeat this question. The question is, with respect to Professor Stubblebine's characterization of the essential fairness of Prop 13, is he comfortable that that fairness also held with respect to the distinction between, in effect, residential properties and commercial properties?
I'm going to answer simply yes, but let me see if I can't briefly say why. If it's not residential, let's think about it as non-residential. What are the non-residential properties and who owns them? The fact is, a whole bunch of farmers, people who operate cleaning establishments and shoemakers and pharmacists, all of these people own commercial property. They're not any different from most everybody else. And their livelihoods are caught up in their businesses. Okay? So
They draw income from it and can pass the property taxes on to the consumer. They own
You want to repeat that?
Can they just pass it on in the form of higher price? It depends on the nature of the services. California has to compete with other markets, and to the extent, there's always some limit to the extent to which you can take it on. What would happen is if you split the role at this point, is a lot of farmers, shoemakers, lawyers, doctors, okay, that whole group of people would take some significant wealth losses because those properties would suddenly be worth a lot less than they are now. Okay? By the way, part of the genius of Prop 13, the reason it's going to be very difficult to undo all of this is because after a couple of years, you're an old property owner and you have a big stake in maintaining this system. And that's a genius in this process. These guys knew what they were doing. They constantly recreated large majorities to maintain Prop 13.
Yep. Actually, it often struck me that, in fact, our property tax limitation has a little bit the same effect as rent control does in places like New York. It keeps people staying put in the places that they're in much longer than they would otherwise, and keeps newcomers, makes it harder for newcomers to gain entry, and creates all kinds of related distortions. And with respect to your question about business, one of the things you want to do, one of the arguments for a split roll would be that you want to encourage the highest use in business of property. If you tax at real value, it will encourage that higher use. If you don't, it's likely to keep a lot of stuff underused, whatever it is, rotting gas stations on street corners where something much more productive and higher value could be established. So I think if you're a pure sort of market economist, I think you would be concerned about that.
Okay.
Do I get a rebut on that one?
No. You are.
I was trying to bait you on that one.
Let's go to Michael Curtis, then you're next.
On moving forward on solutions, how would each of the panelists support or not support the idea, since we centralize control of education finance, that we would decentralize the operation through much more cutting the strings? It's not rocket science. You collect it centrally and then send it down to the locals with fewer strings. Instead, what we've been doing is piling categorical mandate on top of categorical mandate, making the centralization even more complex. Mrs. Thatcher had the idea of you centralize the standards and you decentralize the operation. Centralize what, decentralize how. We centralize what and how, and would you support changing that around?
To repeat the question, is there a way to simplify the allocation of funds, as long as, if they are collected at the state level, as in fact they are today in California, a good share of them, is there some way to simplify the process of moving the money to the local level without tying it with so many strings as we currently do? I don't know who wants to respond to that. Okay.
Yes. I mean, yes.
How would you do it?
Well, I mean, how would you do it? I mean, how would you convert the, Pete Wilson and 120 legislators to see things a little more rationally? That I don't know the answer to, Mike. As you know, nobody does. But it's obviously not hard to do if you set a set of state standards and you don't impose all of the other strings, and that would go for everything. I mean, as you recall, one of the campaign slogans only 4 years ago of our president, and I think the governor too, was get rid of the education code or cut the education code. We only need, as long as we agree that you have to have toilets and and fresh air and so on, but the rest of it you can devolve down to the local level. Of course, in the intervening 4 years, we've piled more, we made the education code longer and more complicated. So I suppose the first thing you have to do is basically stop doing what we've been doing right along. And then obviously you have to get rid of some of this stuff. And how you do that politically, I don't know.
Greg?
I'm a little uncomfortable with sending the decision-making down without sending down the power to tax and to spend, to tax as well as to spend. However, let me respond more directly. Let me confess that Mrs. Stubblebine is a public school teacher. And by the way, I don't know how she voted on Prop 13. I rather have a feeling that she voted for it. But we've never actually talked about it. She knew what.
What do you talk about?
And she waives the property tax bill when it comes, and I say, well, but look at what we did with decision making. And she says, that's all right, when you write the check, you'll be happy. Ms. Stubblebine's a public school teacher. Okay, prior to these mandates, all right, let me tell you a little story about what happens. And it ties in with something Peter Schrag said about teacher salaries. You institute collective bargaining for teachers. So each year, school board sits down and the representatives of the local union sit down, they start bargaining. They're bargaining about lots of things, but it comes down to class size and salaries. And they come down to the last day, and finally the school board says, well, you got to choose between having smaller classes and more teachers or higher salaries. The OMTA, the Teachers Association, said, well, we'll take higher salaries this year and we'll worry about class size next year. And it goes that way every year. The result is you get a Wilson initiative that says what? You can't spend this additional money on teacher salaries. You got to hire more teachers, build more classrooms, and have smaller classes. That's a mandate. But it's a mandate that's responding to the fact that you have a bad situation in that bargaining at the local level. And I think it's a very I thought Wilson's had a very constructive suggestion to overcome what had become manifest.
Just a point of clarification, Professor Stubblebine, you said that spending on public safety now in California and all the other states is higher than was before. And I just wondered whether that includes the budget for the Department of Corrections.
Oh, yes.
The question is, the point was made by Professor Stubblebine that the spending on public safety is higher today than it was in 1978, and the question was, does that include the Department of Corrections?
Yeah, it does, yeah. By the way, the California versus the rest of the world went from 30% higher than the rest of the world to 43% higher than the rest of the world.
Okay, we got a question here and then one here. Please.
I'm going to try to squeeze two out and ask you to respond to both. Back to unintended consequences and talking about local government, do you think it's important to also look at divisiveness between different local governments and how they're relating to each other? For example, school boards and cities that share jurisdictions. And in that regard, I wonder if you might recall Dan Walter's editorial a few months ago about school boards, and perhaps an unintended consequence has been, since the spending power has been taken away, we are seeing more and more school board people interested in school boards coming for other reasons. The person who becomes a school board member is not the person who became a school board member years ago. And what does that do to local government? The other thing is on the initiative, and whether it's majoritarian and whether it can be a remedy, could you just comment on what the realities are today about the dollars and the initiative and who's really running initiatives? Are they really majoritarian or are they controlled by special interests?
The first, just to repeat the first question, and that is, I think, to reduce it down, that has Prop 13 generated a 20-year period of divisiveness between local governments as they position themselves and compete against each other for a bigger piece of the local revenue pie. And why don't we take that one first?
This is the one about her first question, or
Yes.
this? As to the point that Dan Walters made, yeah, I think it's correct. I would add one other thing, and that is that with term limits, it also creates a greater inducement for people to run for local office because so many more doors open up so much more quickly to state office and so on. But I also think the other thing is there, which is the fact that you don't have that sort of that old-fashioned conservative, and I don't mean conservative right-wing, I mean conservative in all the ways that it means it. Interest declines because I mean, I have this phrase keeps running through my mind. No representation without taxation. You're no longer interested. If the school board or the city council can't bite you, you may be less interested in getting involved in the campaign. If they can bite you, you're probably going to be more active. And so I think on both those things, I can go. Do you want me to answer the other question?
Please.
Okay. As to the business about money, the question was, to what extent, I'm going to oversimplify your question, to what extent does money play a critical role in the initiative process? I think is that fair? And the answer is, in some ways, very much so, in other ways not. It's often hard for sheer money just to pass something. It's usually fairly easy for sheer money to defeat something. At the same time, it's probably true, and this is an interesting metaphysical, or maybe it's a philosophical question. If people vote for something that could have only gotten on the ballot with a lot of money from some interest group, and I'm not talking necessarily about an economic interest group, the Republican Party or the governor who puts a lot of money into, say, Prop 209, which would not have qualified probably if it hadn't been for money that he helped generate, and then it's passed by the voters. Does that make it an interest group measure or a money measure, or does that make it a popular measure? And you can argue that either way. The fact is, it's almost impossible to get any initiative on the ballot these days without a substantial number of paid signatures. And that's, and at the same time, the professionals in the field will also tell you with enough money you can get anything on the ballot. That doesn't mean you can pass it.
Yeah, I would just add the following, because first of all, it's got to be a special interest that's going to draft an initiative. Okay, there's got to be some interest out there, and that's going to be a small group. And then the issue, as Schrag suggests, is to pass it to the majority. I would invite the following test for anybody. Go back over the last 10 years. Take all the initiatives that have been on the ballot. My evaluation, not all, do I agree with everything that was passed and rejected? Absolutely not. But I'll tell you, I am impressed at the ability of the California electorate to walk through those ballots and in general, overall, come out with very sensible results on these initiatives. Doesn't mean I win them all, okay, but I don't lose them all either, all right? But my gosh, I'm just awed by how well the electorate gets through that process and the extent to which they can ignore money and all of these things. I just think it's awesome.
Rob.
I'll address the question primarily to Peter Schrag because he's a little less happy with problems. But I'd be interested if you have an answer to this too, Professor Stubblebine. Do you think there's any hope in trying to work toward a compromise where we could keep the predictability of the property tax and at the same time get rid of some of the unintended consequences such as the fiscalization of land use?
Question is there a way that the panelists could imagine keeping the predictability of the property tax base as it's now built into Prop 13, but at the same time free it up of some of the more onerous unintended consequences, which those seem to depend on who you're talking to at what time of day. So.
And it ties in very much with David Abel's question earlier, which is how do you devolve some authority back to local government? And the answer is yes, you can do it. Obviously, you can give local government, whether it's at a regional basis or on a county level or whatever, much more control over the property tax that now is controlled by Sacramento. And in fact, there are certain very odd things that have happened. I mean, during the recession, for example, we had fire districts in this county that were rolling in dough, even while the county was struggling. And if there had been some reasonable central authority, now, I'm not sure the voters would have ever gone for this, because voters love fire districts and love all those nice little firefighters. I hope there's no, you know, this is, I don't have anything, I have nothing against firefighters. But it seems to me, if there'd been more of a central authority there at a county or regional level that could have divvied up some of that money in a more reasonable way, I think that's also, by the way, one of the ways that we've gotten those public safety numbers up so high, because of, I think that could be done, to devolve more of that authority back to, and I think that would also regenerate some more citizen interest in what government does. Even though it can't jack up what you're paying, it could at least determine a little bit more about where the money goes, rather than having it all happen up here. I think there are a number of other things. There's always been this sort of ongoing argument, which is, and as you know, for example, the University of California has looked for some kind of guaranteed level of revenue, and that goes back to what Professor Stubblebine is. He's right. If you have that guaranteed level of revenue, then how do you increase how do you get the accountability that goes with it? And everybody, of course, wants their own little Prop 98, and that's, of course, one of the worries, is that you end up setting up all those little categories. That could happen at the local level too. But I'm sure there are ways of doing that. But I also think that ultimately you probably have to to some extent, put the taxpayer at some risk in order for the taxpayer to get engaged again in the political process.
My turn? Do I have any credibility left with this group at all?
You're doing fine.
Because if I still have credibility, I'm not sure I want to say the next thing I was going to say. If I don't have any credibility, then it doesn't matter. Actually, the issue is, can you restore local control with local accountability? And I think potentially the answer is yes, and relatively simple. Earlier I had made the point that currently the income tax, property tax, and general sales tax are all generating about the same amount of revenues. There is absolutely nothing except history that would argue against moving the property tax all the way to the state level. In some sense it already has been, and letting that become the base revenue of state government, and moving the income tax to the local level, which could be operated much in the same way as the millage rates on the old property tax. And then you would have all of this flexibility, accountability. Claremont could go back to being a nest of liberal spending people, right? Temple City could go back and not spend very much. Okay, but that's potentially, I mean, it sounds dramatic, but it's actually history that left the property tax at the local level and the income tax at the state level. There's nothing that would, at least in principle, you could make the switch and local governments could go back to being responsible.
We have one question left, and then I'd like to have our two speakers, when they're answering this question, make your wrap-up statements at the same time. And
My name is Leah Hinkle. I'm from Modesto Junior College, and I'm really glad that you enjoy Proposition 13's benefits. However, I don't see people staying in an area or in a household or a business long enough to reap the benefits. And would you agree that we're paying for Volkswagen services and education, but we're expecting Cadillac services and education, and it's hard to manage between paying for it and having it, because the education at this point, we're looking into private schools people are paying into our systems, and parents coming into the classroom, we've got a whole load of concerns going there, and it's basically about money and spending per student.
I'm going to try to simplify the question by saying I think you're identifying the fact that there is a mismatch between our ability to raise revenues at the local level and our preference for services, which tend to be in the Cadillac category, and our ability to raise revenues in the Volvo category. So with that, sorry, Volkswagen. Sorry,
You haven't bought a Volvo.
I haven't bought a Volvo. It's been years. And with that metaphor, which I've always been told you should never use metaphors as a way to get off the stage, we're stuck with Cadillacs and Volkswagens, and I'm going to have you each make your closing statements. Peter?
Well, I suppose I would just be sort of restating what I've said. I have concerns on two levels with the, and I think on some things I'm in agreement with Professor Stubblebine, but it seems to me I have concerns at two levels. One has to do with substance, with the quality of where we've gone. The other has to do with our growing inability, the way we've tied ourselves into knots, and we keep doing it, and essentially we keep going more and more into the plebiscitary kind of mode and as I say, I think that, and I think by its nature, the initiative is something that, by definition, majorities can use, minorities can't use it. It's not very respectful of minorities in the way it operates. On the tax and spend thing, I really do think that to some extent, ultimately, again, you have to trust government. I mean, one of the things that I keep asking myself, and it's a question that what if there'd been no initiative process in California in 1978, when as the property taxes were shooting up through the roof? What would have happened? I think what would have happened is it would have reached a critical mass. I don't think there would have been armed revolt. I don't think there would have been blood in the streets. I think it would have reached a critical mass, and it would have become a major legislative issue either in June or in November of that year. The legislature would have addressed it. It would have thereby re-energized itself in some way, I think, even despite Jerry Brown and all the rest. And I think we might have gone down a different path in terms of public access, public accountability, and put new strength into our elective institutions rather than going down this other road. I can't guarantee that. This is counterfactual. History is always tricky, but I think that would have been. I think that's the way we would have gone, and I think that would have been great.
Okay, great.
Well, I just have, I guess, a small comment in response to something you said at the outset, and that, do people stay in long enough? One of the interesting things about Prop 13 is that apparently it has just marginally increased or decreased the turnover rate. In fact, people largely are unaffected by Prop 13, and if you look over California, they're churning properties at about this at a slightly slower rate, as best we can tell, at a slightly slower rate than pre-Prop 13, but in fact the turnover rate has not been bigly affected by this.
These big people driving out to the desk a little bit.
This all was happening before Prop 13. It's happening afterwards, and people are not being trapped in their houses by Prop 13.
Well, okay, I got the high sign back there, and I'm going to close it up right now and use this opportunity to make a little pitch for the little envelope you have here. Contains a number of documents which summarize the current work at PPIC on Prop 13. I bring to your attention a gray-covered document saying some unintended consequences of Prop 13 prepared by Jeff Chapman. And on that, we thank you very much for coming, and a lively greeting.